So then how do we move forward? Now that generational gap is getting wider and wider.
Well, see, I want to come back to this idea that they're not as different. There is literature that will say that today's youth is a much closer culturally to today's adults than it's ever been. So for example, my father and my grandfather didn't dress alike, they didn't listen to the same music, they didn't shop in the same stores, but my father and I, and youth that are like somewhat a little bit younger than me, we all listen to the same music, we all wear the same jeans. There's no dressing like an adult versus dressing like a youth anymore. We're learning the same lingo. They're smarter at me at Facebook, but I'm smarter at them than other things. So, it kind of balances it out. So in some ways, I don't know if that gap is pronounced across the board. Certainly there are some things, what takes, my 19-year-old cousin 2 minutes to do on Facebook takes me hours. And I'm frustrated with it, but it's probably, she's grown up in that generation, right? At the same time, there's other things like, if I need to do research with books as opposed to the internet, it'll take her hours to find something I can find in half an hour, right? So there are, but the basic kind of ideas of, what turns youth on and what turns youth off, I don't think they're much different. But in the interest of time, I did want to answer your question about, what do we do about ethnic silos? And what UBC students are calling ethnic cliquing. We know that Vancouver is known all over the world as being a cliquey city, and one of the manifestations of that is ethnic cliquing. And so there's two things that I'd like to suggest in terms of that. First, mobilize the 1.5 and second generation youth. They are natural bridges between immigrant and mainstream communities. They often can fluidly move between these spaces. They understand the language of both the mainstream corporate world as well as the language of a multicultural community. But they're often forgotten about. They're not visible in mainstream media. They're almost forgotten about, and they're not visible in ethnic or in language or whatever kind of media you want to call it. Despite the fact that statistically 1.5 and second generation youth are the most affluent, the most educated, the most connected, the most influential, right? They're now professionalizing at a rate faster than any other group in Canada, and they are making the big decisions for large households, but no one's paying attention to them, right? And so it's a really fascinating thing. They have the potential to break these silos. The second thing is, let's not discount the power of sports culture. Yep. One of the things that we learned at CBC is that one of the only shows that families watch together is Hockey Night in Canada. And, Punjabi-speaking grandparents and their English-speaking grandchildren will watch hockey together and nothing else. Everything else, so there is power in that commonality, and they don't necessarily need to have it in their language, although it's nice if it is. When CBC broadcast Punjabi Hockey Night in Canada in Punjabi, we were getting emails from people saying, "I've never felt more Canadian ever. I've lived here for 35 years. I've never felt more Canadian ever because I can talk hockey with my grandfather now." And we have this commonality that we didn't used to have.
And perhaps that's something that mainstream media should look at. Yeah. Perhaps doing. I mean, it doesn't. It's probably very cost efficient if you just have a service that, say, you can subscribe to in your cable provider that has the ethnic translation,
dubbing,
dubbing on the bottom. I think you can watch Peter Mansbridge, but he's dubbed in Punjabi. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That involves hiring one person to do
it.
You know what I mean? But the need is there. You're absolutely right.
I think that's really important how much Canadian identity is tied to our media, and it's always been like that. Like our first Canadian multicultural broadcast media policies, they were always tied together, and media was used as a way to form Canadian identity, which was based on, colonial French and English originally. But now, how has that shifted to reflect?
I'd like to ask a question about, I think I catch myself comparing Canadian media to American media a lot, but I'd like to compare CBC with BBC. I think BBC I watch BBC, and my parents do as well. They have a program in Persian, and they have programs in many different languages, and you can watch them online or on air. And I think BBC does a great job. They have BBC One, Two, and they have different variety of programs, from drama to documentary to news, to just everything, just about everything. And they're very well built, well put together, and it's a British broadcasting channel.
The reason they're able to do that is because every Briton, every citizen of England, has to pay close to $250 a year to have a TV.
Yeah.
The average Canadian pays $35. $35 to the CBC to help support the CBC. Now, if Canadians paid $250 a year to CBC, the things it could do to benefit society, even if it paid $50 a year.
Just to double that.
Just to
it
double what
makes
it was.
a lot of difference.
Oh, with the things it could do.
I think from my standpoint of view, again, when it comes to funding, I think how does it work in this country? It's just through taxes or whatever. I think using those methods to support kind of, I like CBC personally. I think it used to do greater things at some points not really. But I think generally, from what I feel, is underfunded, and I think it could grow just as BBC has, which I really enjoy, to be something beyond that. And I mean, if people see that, if people see programs produced by CBC that they enjoy, they start to support it. I don't care if I pay $100 a year for it, $200 a year for it. Maybe it comes out of my tax. I don't even know. Someone makes 3 times as much money as me per year. They'll pay a little bit more than me. That's how tax system works, right? So.
I agree. And those satellites that your parents have and a lot of people have are very expensive every month.
Yeah.
So I'm sure that they pay $50 rather than around $80 to $100, because I know how much they cost.
It's a one-time thing.
Oh, it's a one-time thing?
$200, you're done.
Once you buy the dish, that
Yeah,
kind
well,
of
the dish is also another expense, but why not spend an extra $20 on the $35 that we already spent?
And
Take the 200 divided by a year.
And just as BBC takes the message from Britain, I mean the multicultural society in Britain, which is I think very different, and I think Canadian society could learn a lot of lessons. I mean right now it's a little bit, they're saying, oh, it doesn't work, blah blah blah. I think they're just bullshitting, but
well.
anyways, but I think they can learn a lot of lessons.
I think you're right. It's about funding primarily, and also in Britain, why some people are opposed to the BBC, there still seems to be a strong level of public support, I mean, that kind of time-honored tradition. It's also, the kind of thing they exported to the world, and there's a certain kind of romantic attachment, to that. If you let it go, and the rest of them, for some reason, it's almost a part and parcel of our social fabric. In Canada, CBC, sometimes the politicians are not exactly too sure to what extent they want to really push for its support, depending on what government is in power. Even when the Liberal government is in power, it's almost like a half-hearted, support for that. Then some other people that kind of feel like, maybe it's a little bit.
It hasn't mattered. The party hasn't mattered. In fact, the Liberal has more of a history of cutting CBC's budget.
So if the government itself is undermining, this thing, then to what extent do you want? They have to be in front, to kind of convince Canadians that there's a need to provide, either pay a little bit more in terms of, taxes or whatever to make the CBC live up to its mandate. But it doesn't happen, and unfortunately, for a whole lot of reasons, and that's just the reality.
I think CBC could potentially, like BBC, cater to the world.
What about the whole issue of demand and supply? What if all of a sudden the young people because I see the main media, even the news media, CTV, CBC, they always say, you can follow us on Twitter. What if the demand from the young people turn the tide? Does that play a part, you mean? does the media
demand
respond?
Is there. I think the supply's not there. I think the demand is there. Be it youth, be it the 1.5 generation, the second generation. I think the demand is definitely there.
It is there.
I think the media is slow to react. That's what I think it is, and that's
demand is being filled in other conduits.
exactly. That's why Fairchild and all those small ethnic channels exist. Because the demand is definitely there.
I think the reason being for media to being slow, I think generally that's become the trend. I mean, I go to school and they've stopped kind of renewing technology recently just because they're like, well, if you pay this much for this, then the next day we're going to have something newer that we got to get. We might as well skip a few generations and then spend money then. And I think that's an issue as well of constantly keeping up with constant change, which is very exhausting and takes a lot of resources as well, which is understandable, but it's finding the right balance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The media, the size of the youth in the U.S. is much bigger
Yeah.
than the baby boomers in Canada. So we have a particular bubble of population. So even if all the youth wanted something, the baby boomers will ultimately determine what will happen with the media. So for example, right now, smartphone developers are racing to be the first to put out the smartphone for seniors, because that's actually the big market. The youth market was there to kind of raise the cool factor. They're the early adopters, but the real big money is how do you get seniors to buy smartphones? And so it's kind of an interesting thing where I know we're trying to empower youth, we're trying to give youth the voice, they are the future of the world and all this sort of thing, but at the same time, the supply and demand will always bias towards who is the biggest population, yeah.
Are you taking into consideration the immigrant population though? Because I read somewhere that Vancouver's or Lower Mainland in 2015 or something, the immigrants will basically outweigh in numbers the
It's 2030.
2030 or
yeah.
something. Yeah.
2015 seems
I don't
too
know.
early.
But I read it somewhere. Yeah. I mean, and immigrants aren't all old. They're bringing babies. They're bringing
They're actually
what I mean?
younger.
They're younger. Yeah.
It wasn't immigrants, it was visible minorities. Visible minorities will outnumber, will no longer be the minority. So they could be second, third generation.
Of course. Yeah. And then that means that they're younger. So. Yeah.